Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Truth to remember, taking it one step at a time. When we take one step toward God, He will take 7 steps toward us. Amen. Last week, I gave you a handout on 1st Corinthians 13. I wonder if everyone were able to look at it and familiarize yourself with 1st Corinthians 13. It's the love chapter. What the Bahamas needs now is love, sweet love. And it emanates from this house of assembly and throughout the Bahama Islands. And I'm going to pray back 1 Corinthians 13. Let's pray. Lord, because love is patient, help us to be slow to judge, but quick to listen, hesitant to criticize, but eager to encourage, remembering your endless patience with us. Because love is kind, help our words to be gentle and our actions to be thoughtful. Remind us to smile and to say please and thank you, because those little things still mean so much. Because love does not envy or boast, and it is not proud. Help us have a heart that is humble and sees the good in others. May we celebrate and appreciate all that we have and all that we are, as well as doing the same for those around us. Because love is not rude or self-seeking. Help us to speak words that are easy on the air and on the heart. When we are tempted to get wrapped up in our own little world, remind us there's a great big world out there full of needs and hurts. Because love is not easily angered and keeps no record of wrongs. Help us to forgive others as you have forgiven us. When we want to hold on to a grudge, gently help us release it so we can reach out with a hand of love instead. Because love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Help us to stand up for what is right and good. May we defend the defenseless and help the helpless. Show us how we can make a difference. Because love always protects and always trusts. Help us to be a refuge for those around us when the world outside is harsh and cold. May our hearts be a place of acceptance and warmth. Finally, because love always perseveres, help our hearts continually beat with love for you and others. Thank you for showing us what the word love really means. Amen. Amen. Praying the prayer, honorable members, our Father taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. One more thing. Would you shake hands with the person next to you and say to them, God loves you, and so do I. Amen. Okay. All right.
Peter Turnquest, Brent Simonet, Desmond Bannister, Jeffrey Lloyd, Dr. Dwayne Sand, Marvin Dane, Frankie Campbell, Dionisio de Aguilar, Michael Pintard, Darren Penfield, Ramal Ferreira, Lanisha Rose, Brenzel Rose, Elsworth Johnson, Philip Davis, Vaughn Miller, Patricia Parker Edstrom, Hiram Lewis, Carlton Bolag, James Aubrey, Travis Robinson, Adrian Gibson, Donald Saunders, Frederick McAlpine, Hank Johnson, Mark Humes, Michael Fuss, Miriam Reckley Emmanuel, Reese Shipman, Reuben Manning, Ricky Mackey, Shannon Don Cartwright, Sean L. Ferguson, Glennis Hannah Martin, Tycho Forbes, Chester Cooper.
Good morning, honorable members. Communications by the Speaker. There will be no communication by the Speaker this morning. Introduction and swearing in of new members. Lying of documents by ministers. The Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House the Bahamas Registered Stock Directions 2018, Bahamas Registered Stock 2021, 23, 25, 28, and 2038.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document will lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House the Grand Bahama Port Area Incentives Extension of Time Application Order 2018.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document do lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers.
Minister Wells. Minister Wells.
The Chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House a copy of the following: the National Tripartite Council Annual Report for the year ending 2015.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document will lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. Chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House a copy of the following: the Consumer Protection Commission Annual Report for the period the 1st of April 2017 to the 31st of March 2017.
order that the document will lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. Any further laying of documents by ministers? None? Statements and communications by ministers. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is always an honor and a pleasure to rise in this House to speak on behalf of the people of East Grand Bahama. I had the opportunity to spend some time in Sweeting Ski on the weekend. For those who don't know, a beautiful little quaint community of very industrious people, and I want to thank them for their hospitality, and we were able to share some ideas, particularly in respect to, as you would know, Mr. Speaker, we were beneficiaries of a grant from the Japanese Poverty Alleviation Fund to help with conservation, and part of that grant is to develop alternatives to conch fishing, or to expand the use of the conch byproducts in order to create opportunities for revenue for non-fisher persons, as well as those who may be in allied careers or skills. And so I do want to give special thanks to the government of Japan, as well as to the IDB and the Bahamas National Trust, who will manage that fund, for this generous grant and the tremendous benefit that it will have to the people of that community, and by extension the Bahamas, from that research that will be done. We certainly look forward to creating opportunities for our people as we go forward in non-traditional ways. Mr. Speaker, I am told that on Friday we will celebrate the anniversary of the enactment of the women's right to vote on the 23rd of February. And the first vote, first exercised the right in 1962, June of 1962. I want to recognize that significant date, Mr. Speaker, because it did change the course of politics and governance in our country. And certainly we are very proud of the achievement of women in this country overall. And for us in the Free National Movement, we are certainly very proud of the fact that we had the opportunity, or we had the privilege of having the first woman elected to the House of Assembly, Ms. Janet Bostwick, and the first female Speaker of the House, Ms. Natalia Johnson. And even today, Mr. Speaker, the tradition of supporting women in high office in this country continues with the appointment of the present President of the Senate, Senator K4 Smith, who is with us today. Certainly, you know, a bird can't fly on half a wing. And so it is very important that women take their rightful place in supporting the institutions and progressing the governance of this country, as they have done in the private sector. And so I just want to recognize that day and congratulate women for the continued progress that they make in this country, acknowledging that we still have some ways to go. Mr. Speaker, today is the day when we look at where we are at this midpoint versus the budget proposal that we put forth back in May. The purpose of this statement is to provide a succinct and punctual initial update on the fiscal developments during the first half of the 2017-18 fiscal year. A more detailed and comprehensive mid-year fiscal update will be presented to Parliament during my contribution to the debate on the mid-year statement and related resolutions. Mr. Speaker, I begin by providing a brief overview of the nation's economic performance and prospects, given the immediate relationship between the country's fiscal performance and the evolution of the domestic economy. On that score, there are clear indications that the Bahamian economy has finally begun to recover from its lengthy period of underperformance. Over the 4-year period between 2012 and 16, the economy actually shrank in real terms from 10.7 billion to 10.2 billion. Mr. Speaker, however, I am pleased to advise that the present estimates indicate the economy recorded real growth on the order of 1.8% in 2017. This renewed buoyancy stemmed primarily from construction activity associated with ongoing foreign investment projects, as well as rebuilding work in the wake of the hurricanes. While the rate of unemployment did rise marginally between May and November of last year, it stood fully 1.5 percentage points lower than a year earlier. All of the islands surveyed also posted lower rates of unemployment than that experienced in November 2016. Mr. Speaker, prospects for the economy in 2018 are for yet further strengthening of activity, with real growth estimates at 2.5%. Conditions in the labor market are consequently also expected to improve. These developments will be underpinned by the completion of Baha Mar's phased opening and by various foreign investment-related projects which have been foreshadowed by the Prime Minister. As well, we expect the growth of both the tourism sector and the national economy to be favorably impacted by strong projected growth in the United States, our major trading partner. In its latest forecast, the IMF has boosted its forecast for U.S. growth by 0.4 percentage points to a level of 2.7%. The increase in investor and consumer confidence in the United States, again our most important trading partner, augurs well for continued growth in tourist travel to and investment here in the islands of the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to point out at the very outset that the public finances of the Bahamas are in a better place than they were at the midpoint of the last fiscal year. The aggregate GFS deficit for the first 6 months of the current fiscal year totaled $198 million, down sharply from the deficit of $290.3 million recorded by the previous administration at the midpoint of the 2016-17 fiscal year. The latter figure at the midpoint of last fiscal year represented nearly 3 times the total deficit that had been projected for the entire year. It also presaged the eventual GFS deficit outturn for the entire 2016-17 fiscal year, which at $676 million dwarfed the previous government's budget estimate of $100 million. Mr. Speaker, the government of the Bahamas finances on a cash basis. Yes, sir. Mr. Speaker, it is important that I pause to explain the expenditure numbers detailed in our published mid-year report being laid this morning. The recurrent expenditure number at the mid-year of $1.79 billion appears to show a sharp increase in recurrent expenditure. This is occasioned, however, by the spike in the debt redemptions or debt repayments of over $540 million when compared to the same point last year, as illustrated in the summary report. This significant bump up in debt repayment was due to the repayment of short-term financing obtained to meet immediate financing needs in anticipation of the $750 million bond secured by the government. When you adjust for the debt repayment numbers in both years, one would readily observe that the total government expenditure, both recurrent and capital, at the midpoint of the current fiscal year is $1.078 billion as compared to $1.146 billion last year, indicating a decrease in spending of some $67.5 million. This, coupled with an increase in revenue collection of $24.8 million, is what has led to the improvement in the deficit position by some $92.3 million. Mr. Speaker, that said, this year's GFS deficit at the mid-year does, however, represent some 61% of the $323 million full-year deficit that has been projected in last May's budget communication. To a large extent, this development reflects the ongoing overhang of commitments of the previous administration that have had to be met during the current fiscal year. To date, Mr. Speaker, we have had to make provisions to settle more than $30 million in verified payment arrears over and above what was known during the budget exercise last May. There are tens of millions of dollars in remaining commitments from the prior year, the details of which, again, I will provide during my substantive debate on the matter. Mr. Speaker, it is to be noted that in the May budget communication, the government affirmed its commitment to do better than budget estimates this fiscal year. To that end, the Prime Minister announced last summer an across-the-board 10% reduction in discretionary recurrent expenditure against the budgeted sums, excluding interest payments and debt redemption. I am pleased to say we are on track in this regard, as non-debt servicing expenditure total $861.1 million against a mid-year prorated budgeted sum of $975.3 million. However, with prior year commitments still to be addressed, I have asked ministries and departments to redouble their vigilance through the second half of the fiscal year to ensure that we meet our desired expenditure and deficit targets. Mr. Speaker, the $92.3 million improvement in the GFS deficit in the first half of this fiscal year, as compared to the previous year, largely reflects a deliberate $76.4 million reduction in capital expenditure from $15.2 million last year to $75.8 million this year. This fiscal year, the government has exercised extreme prudence in the commitments for capital expenditure, ensuring that only meaningful and critical public investments are approved. That said, we acknowledge that our public infrastructure plant, in too many cases, remains well below the standards for a 21st century Bahamas. The government commits over this term in office to find creative and efficient ways to substantially increase productive investments in our hospitals, schools, clinics, and airports, and our digital infrastructure to allow for the sustained social and economic development of Bahamians throughout the full archipelago. These investments will be critical to underpin the much-needed improvements in productivity, boost the growth potential of the Bahamian economy, and thereby contribute to enhanced job opportunities for our citizens. Mr. Speaker, in the first half of this fiscal year, some $69 million was expended from current government resources as part of the $100 million that the government is to invest or has invested in Resolve Bahamas Limited. As I foreshadowed in my statement to Parliament on Resolve, and as was disclosed at the time of our recent international bond issuance, the government committed to facilitate Resolve's retiring the original $100 million promissory note issued to the Bank of the Bahamas in respect of the initial tranche of toxic loan transfers in accordance with an agreed schedule. After exploring funding options, the government is of the view that it would be best to access the domestic market given the ample level of excess liquidity, and in line with this commitment, new corresponding borrowing authorities will be sought from Parliament today to cover this sum. Mr. Speaker, recurrent expenditure adjusted for debt repayment during the first 6 months of the current fiscal year totals some $1 billion and $3 million, up slightly from $994 million in the corresponding period of 2016-17. As mentioned, the outturn this year was negatively impacted by the overhang commitments of the previous administrations referenced above. Despite this, the expenditure total this year represents only 44.7% of the amount budgeted for the entire fiscal year, as compared to 50% in the first half of 2016-17. Mr. Speaker, despite the 10% cut being implemented across the board, the amount spent on personal emoluments, salaries, and allowances in the first half of this year totaled $373 million as compared to $358 million in the corresponding period 2016-17, a $15 million increase. This is primarily explained by the recent industrial agreements related lump sum payments of $7.7 million and outstanding overtime payments to the police, $6 million. Given the contributions of the salary bill to our overall recurrent expenditure, the government will continue to manage this element of our budgetary spending, especially in light of pension obligations and the need still to recruit and retain professional talent in the public service. Now, Mr. Speaker, I just want to repeat that because I know the mischief makers will get to work. But speaking about personal emoluments, this is primarily explained by the recent industrial agreement-related lump sum payment of $7.7 million and outstanding overtime payments to the police of $6 million. Yeah.
We're giving the police their money.
Mm-hmm. In the first half,
We did not
purchases of goods and services.
You know better. You know better.
I just remind the opposite side that I still have to make a substantive contribution when we come back to debate the budget. So that $2 million, I'll explain to you what that is too. Okay. In the first half, purchases of goods and services totaled $133 million, compared with $127 million in 2016-17. This year's total, however, represents only 35.9% of the full year budgeted amount, as compared to 39.7% in 2016-17. As mentioned, in the first 6 months of 2017-18 fiscal year, recurrent revenue at $881 million was up $25 million from the same period the previous year. Tax revenue was up $18.7 million in the first half as compared to the previous year. Within this category, value-added tax was up by $10 million, motor vehicle tax by $7 million, gaming tax by $5 million, and excise tax by $3.8 million. Import duties, however, were down by $6 million. Non-tax revenue was higher by $6 million. While we are pleased at the uptick in revenue collection so far for the fiscal year, The outturn represents 41% of the full year amount forecasted in this year's budget. While we anticipate that, consistent with past years, the outturn for the second half will be proportionately higher, the current performance further underscores the need to contain expenditure to ensure that deficits and debt targets are met. Mr. Speaker, in concluding, the overriding message that flows from the first half fiscal results is that the government is on track to bring the country's fiscal house in order. Notwithstanding the dire fiscal situation that the administration met coming into office. Even though the situation has been compounded by the millions of dollars in past debt obligations that this administration continues to address, we remain on track to meet our budgetary deficits targets at year end. A lot of financial jargon used may be confusing for some, and also used by others for nothing more than to fuel political mischief. Therefore, in conclusion, let me lay it out in simple terms that all would understand. For the first half of the year, I am pleased to advise the Bahamian people that revenue collection is up by $25 million compared to last year through December. Overall spending, not related to debt redemption, is down by $67 million compared to last year through December. The full GFS deficit position has improved by $92.3 million when compared to last year. And this has occurred, Mr. Speaker, while still paying off tens of millions of dollars left in bills by the former administration. Mr. Speaker, clearly the fiscal situation has improved and continues to improve. However, ongoing dedication and vigilance are warranted for the remainder of the fiscal year to enable the government to achieve the desired level of fiscal consolidation. We shall have to maintain expenditure restraints. We shall have to maximize our revenue yields. Thus, we must remain faithful to the various restraint measures and initiatives that were summarily set out in the May budget and that are critical to this task. And that, Mr. Speaker, members, Bahamian public, we shall do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further statements and communications by ministers. Order that the communication be brought up. Order that the communication do lie on the table.
Lay on the table of the House the mid-year budget performance during the 6 months ended 31st December 2017.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document do lie on the table. Further statements and communication by ministers.
Permit? Need it now?
Chair recognizes the honourable member for East Grand Bahama.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, as I outlined in my communication, We do wish to lay a resolution for the borrowing of $100 million to satisfy the promissory notes of Resolve Bahamas to the Bank of the Bahamas. And if with your permission, I'd like to lay that now.
Yes, granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas Article 129(1) of the Constitution requires the Minister of Finance, before the end of each fiscal year, to cause to be prepared annual estimates of revenue and expenditure for public service during the succeeding fiscal year, which shall be laid before the House of Assembly, and which estimates have been laid before the House of Assembly. And whereas it is necessary to undertake additional borrowing to provide financing to facilitate Bahamas Resolve Limited retiring the promissory notes, which in the aggregate total $100 million, to the Bank of the Bahamas, of which the government has expended funds from the existing approved estimates during the first half of fiscal year 2017-18, which have been laid before the House of Assembly. And whereas Section 4 of the Bahamas Registered Stock Act, Chapter 362, prescribes the conditions under which the Minister of Finance may raise monies by the creation and issue of registered stock, and whereas from time to time the House of Assembly has approved borrowings by way of loan agreements with banks to finance approved expenditures, and whereas Section 3 of the Development Loans Act, Chapter 382, prescribes the conditions under which the Minister of Finance may borrow externally or internally any amounts not exceeding in the aggregate the equivalent of $100 million in currency of the United States of America, or such greater sums as the House of Assembly may by resolution direct, by the issue and sale of bonds. And whereas by Section 18 of the Financial Administration and Audit Act 2010, number 26 of 2010, it is provided that no loan shall be raised by the government and no guarantees involving a financial liability shall be binding upon the government unless entered into with the prior approval of the House of Assembly, signified by resolution thereof. Now therefore be it resolved that this House, 1, authorizes the Minister of Finance to raise by way of loan or loans the sum of $100 million in the aggregate in such currency as the Minister may determine. 2, authorizes the Minister to raise such amount by way of A, the creation and issue of stock under the provisions of the Bahamas Registered Stock Act, Chapter 362, B, loan agreements with banks, including commercial banks, on such terms are mutually agreed, and C, the issue of bonds under the provisions of the Development Loan Act, Chapter 382, subject to the provisions that the total sum borrowed under paragraph B does not exceed the sum of $100 million necessary to replenish resources expended to invest in Bahamas Resolve Limited, and the House receives communication from the Minister of Finance at the earliest opportunity after the apportionment among A, B, and C above, and 3, approves the proceeds of the said loans being used for the purpose of defraying expenditure related to investment in Bahamas Resolve Limited.
Order that the resolution be brought up. Order that the document do lie on the table. Further statements and communication by ministers. Communications by the clerk. Messages from the Governor General. Messages from the Senate. Motions for leave of absence, leave to resign seat, and new writs. Presentation of petitions. Presentation of reports of committees. Adoption of reports of committees. First reading of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
Mr. Speaker, I rise and beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time the following bill. A bill for an act to amend the Criminal Evidence Witness Anonymity Act 2018.
Is there a second? It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for the first time. A bill for an act to amend the Criminal Evidence Witness Anonymity Act. As many as in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will rise. Order that the bill be read for the first time.
A bill for an act to amend the Criminal Evidence Witness Anonymity Act.
For the first reading of bills. Second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, just a brief intervention so that the House would know what we intend to do going forward today. We've decided that what we're going to do is move the two bills, the Financial Transaction Reporting Bill and the Proceeds of Crime Bill. The Deputy Prime Minister will do so, and then the Minister for State for Legal Affairs from Yamacraw will second the bill, and then the House will suspend until next week, Thursday, to more give the opposition an opportunity to fully be able to ventilate the issues of the proceeds of crime and financial transaction reporting. So that is what we've agreed.
Thank you, honorable member. Second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Financial Transaction Reporting Bill 2018 repeals and replaces the Financial Transactions Reporting Act of 2000 and its amendments thereto. The Caribbean Financial Action Task Force CFATF Mutual Evaluation Report 2017 identified gaps in the Bahamas anti-money laundering, counter-financing terrorism, AML-CFT, legal and regulatory regime. Substantial gaps were identified in 21 out of 40 Financial Action Task Force AML-CFT standards. The enhancements and revisions to the existing Financial Transaction Reporting Act serves to address the gaps in the following recommendations. Recommendation 1, assessing money laundering terrorist financing risks and development of appropriate strategies to control and mitigate such risks, applying a risk-based approach. Recommendation 2, national coordination and cooperation, establishment of appropriate administrative structure to oversee and monitor national identified risk framework. Recommendation 10, customer due diligence, updating verification and identification of facility holders. Recommendation 12, enhanced due diligence on politically exposed persons. Recommendation 15, risk assessments by financial institutions of new technologies. Recommendation 17, reliance on third-party customer due diligence. Recommendation 18, financial institutions' obligations to implement internal controls, procedures, and policies in national and foreign branches and subsidiaries. Recommendation 19, provisions to allow for directions to financial institutions to institute enhanced due diligence against a country's financial sector stakeholders based on FATF recommendations. And recommendation 22, designated non-financial business and professional customer due diligence provisions. Recommendation 23, DNFBP, and I'll just say designated non-financial businesses, obligations to adhere to requirements of recommendation 18, 19, 20, and 21. Recommendation 24, transparency and beneficial ownership of legal persons. Recommendation 25, transparency and beneficial ownership regarding trusts. Recommendation 26, regulation and supervision of financial institutions. Regulation 27, regulation and supervisory powers. Regulation 28, regulation supervision of non-financial businesses. And recommendation 35, provisions for dissuasive sanctions. Honorable Speaker, several provisions of the Financial Transaction Reporting Bill are retained from the existing Financial Transaction Reporting Act. However, the Financial Transaction Reporting Bill includes enhancements, provisions pertaining to the power of the Compliance Commission, financial institutions, risk assessment and internal control obligations, oversight of foreign branches and subsidiaries, prohibition of conducting business with shell banks, and establishment of anonymous facilities, establishments of correspondent relationships, sanctions and offenses for non-compliance. Mr. Speaker, I will go through these clauses of the bill and explain which each clause seeks to achieve. Clause 2 of the bill seeks to expand the list of definitions to ensure the stakeholders are given clear explanations of terms utilized in the provisions. This expanded section covers more than 40 terms, such as identified risks, which means corruption, cybercrime, human trafficking, money laundering, proliferation or financing of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism or financing of terrorism, or such other risks as the minister may prescribe by regulations, which is provided to allow the minister to add additional risk or crimes as they are identified or arise. Mr. Speaker, Clause 3, which gives definition to what is considered a financial institution, remains mostly intact and includes a list of financial institutions from the existing Act, including banks and trust companies, insurance companies, casinos. Clause 4 of the bill is being introduced to segregate the designated non-financial business and professions from the primary financial institutions listed in Clause 3, which are supervised by the Central Bank, Securities Commission, the Insurance Commission, the Inspector of Financial and Corporate Service Providers, and the Gaming Board. This list includes such businesses as dealers of precious stones and metals, pawn stores, PAWN stores, lawyers, accountants, real estate brokers. With respect to the business that falls under the purview of this bill, the Bahamas Mortgage Corporation, the Bahamas Development Bank, and money transfer operations as examples. Mr. Speaker, Clause 5 of the bill emphasizes the current risk assessment obligations that financial institutions must apply in their dealings with customers. An obligation is also placed upon the financial institutions to analyze identified risk and vulnerabilities defined in Clause 2 of the bill before they market any new products, services, and business in order to minimize the risk of abuse. Subclause 1A creates the obligation for the financial institution to take appropriate measures to identify, assess, and understand its identified risks in relation to facility holders, the countries or jurisdictions of its operations, and its products, services, and the delivery channels, and prescribes how that risk assessment is to be carried out. Subclause 1B through E advises of the specific requirements pertaining to development and implementation of risk management systems and interaction between the financial institutions and its supervisory authority. And Subclause 3 obliges financial institutions to document the risk assessment outcomes and to keep the same current. Mr. Speaker, Clause 6 of the bill sets out the customer due diligence requirements that financial institutions must conduct on all facility holders. Subclause 1 obligates the financial institution to undertake customer due diligence measures when opening an account or establishing a business relationship with facility holders. Subclause 2 instructs financial institutions to undertake customer due diligence measures where A, doubt exists about the veracity or adequacy of previously obtained identification information of a facility holder. B, there is a suspicion of activities related to identified risks involving the facility holder or the facility holder's account. C, a person who is neither a facility holder nor in an established business relationship with the financial institution wishes to carry out a transaction to be referred to as an occasional transaction. And D, it is determined that an occasional transaction is being conducted on behalf of a third party or another person. Subclause 3 instructs financial institutions to periodically review business relationships to ensure that the appropriate risk measures are being observed in regards to facility holders and their beneficial owners. Subclause 4 prohibits the establishment of business relationships that are anonymous or created with fictitious names. Subclause 5 instructs casinos and real estate brokers, agents, to undertake full customer due diligence measures where there is a suspicion of identified risks, regardless of the threshold. Mr. Speaker, Clause 7 outlines the diligence measures every financial institution shall carry out, and we are all mostly familiar with those KYC or Know Your Customer requirements, which are not changed here. Subclause 3 speaks to financial institutions taking into account the facility holder's risk assessment as required in Clause 5 when determining the level of due diligence required. Subclause 4 permits, where the risks identified are low, for instance, Bahamians with single or uncomplicated sources of income, for financial institutions to apply simplified due diligence measures as opposed to more complex account holders where enhanced measures shall be undertaken. So this clause permits financial institutions to reduce the amount of KYC, Know Your Customer information that they need to collect when a Bahamian with a single source of income or a simplified source of income goes to open a bank account. And we certainly hope that this provision will be taken on board by the local financial institutions to ease the cost and expense and the onerous burden of opening a bank account and doing business in this country. Again, we sometimes tend to be overly risk averse and take the very complicated and difficult route to protect against that perceived risk. But in doing so, we inconvenience the general public and develop reams of documentation that will not be looked at again until thy kingdom come. And so this introduces a risk-based approach to analyzing customers, facility holders, financial institutions that they can apply based upon their own standards, and hopefully will result in more efficient banking operations from that perspective. Mr. Speaker, Clause 8 of the bill identifies verification of identity procedures for existing facility holders and business relationships. Further, it also lists the requirements that financial institutions should adhere to when considering establishing a business relationship where all customer due diligence requirements have not been undertaken. Clause 9 of the bill deals with the requirements to be adhered to by financial institutions when considering relying on third-party customer due diligence. Mr. Speaker, Clause 10 of the bill prescribes the identification an account opening process for correspondent bank relationships and requires the financial institutions to apply additional measures to identify and verify the identity of a respondent institution with which they enter into a corresponding relationship. For example, when one institution opens an account for another in order to facilitate financial transactions. And this is particularly relevant with respect to money transfer operators, the cash and goes and the MoneyGram and Western Unions and Omni Flash Cash and Mango and all the rest of them, these money transfer operations that have popped up in the last few years. And as well as the gaming houses, I won't call them web shops, the gaming houses, who are also involved in accepting and dispersing cash in their course of business. Clause 11 of the bill sets out the procedure for financial institutions to follow when customer due diligence measures cannot be completed satisfactorily or a potential facility holder. It also outlines the penalties for failing to follow or ignoring the customer due diligence requirements, which range from $500,000 or 2 years imprisonment, or both on summary conviction, or in the case of a legal person, to a fine not exceeding $1 million. Mr. Speaker, Clause 12 of the bill makes provisions for the requirements of an ongoing due diligence on a risk-based approach. Clause 13 and 14 of the bill prescribes the circumstances that must apply when dealing with foreign and domestic politically exposed persons, high-risk jurisdictions, and complex, unusual large transactions or unusual patterns of transactions which necessitate enhanced customer due diligence and ongoing risk management. Mr. Speaker, Clause 15 through 18 mandates and requires financial institutions to maintain books and records with respect to their facility holders, business relationships, and related transactions to ensure that such records and the underlying documentation, information are available on a timely basis to the relevant supervisory authority, FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit, or as and when required to be disclosed. Mr. Speaker, Clause 19 of the bill provides for the development of internal controls and procedures to combat activities related to identified risks. Clause 20 of the bill makes provision for the appointment of compliance officers by financial institutions. Clause 21 of the bill requires the establishment of group-wide internal controls and procedures in respect to groups of entities required to be compliant with Part 2 of the Act. Mr. Speaker, Clause 23 of the bill obligates financial institutions to ensure that their foreign subsidiaries and branches comply with the requirements of the Act. Clause 22 prohibits the establishment of a business relationship with shell banks. A shell bank is defined as a bank with no physical presence in the jurisdiction in which it is incorporated and licensed. Of note is the definition of a physical presence to mean having meaningful mind and management located within the jurisdiction. Local agents or local or low-level staff will not qualify under this provision. So no longer will you be able to have the Secretary act as the representative for a shell bank. You must have mind and management and a physical presence in the jurisdiction. Clause 27 of the bill protects the identity of a person who prepared or made a suspicious transaction report or handled the underlying transaction. Mr. Speaker, Clause 28 of the bill provides for the protection of persons making a suspicious transaction report from criminal and civil liability and disciplinary proceedings. Clause 29 of the bill exempts financial institutions from any legislative provisions relating to confidentiality in fulfilling their obligation under this Act. And Clause 30 of the bill prohibits tipping off facility holders in relation to the filing of suspicious transaction reports. And so I would say to the Bahamian people, those in the financial institution, if there is a suspicious transaction report filed, unfortunately, it is illegal, or it will be illegal, for you to tip off your friend, your family, that there is a report on your account. Mr. Speaker, Clause 31 and 37 of the bill provides for the continuation of the body known as the Compliance Commission, its functions, powers, confidentiality requirements, and other matters relative to its operations. The powers of the Commission have been greatly enhanced with levying of fees for non-compliant registrants and mandatory registration for designated non-financial businesses and professions conducting business noted in Section 4 of the bill. Clause 38 to 45 of the bill provides for investigatory and search powers. Warrants may be obtained from a magistrate for the purpose of searching, seizing documentation, and other evidence with respect to offenses against the provisions of this bill as necessary. Mr. Speaker, Clause 46 to 53 of the bill speaks to the offenses provided in the bill. Offenses including failure to carry out due diligence obligations, failure to comply with identification obligations, failure to report suspicious transactions, false or misleading statements, or confidentiality violations, and can carry a prison term of up to 5 years, fines of up to $500,000, or both. Mr. Speaker, Part 6, Clause 54 of the bill deals with the miscellaneous provisions of the bill, including provisions on the liability of employers and principals. That is, employers and principals of a business are deemed guilty of non-compliance with provisions of the bill or omissions in complying with provisions of the bill when employees or agents do not comply with the provisions of the bill by omission or by willful actions. Clause 55 of the bill deals with the liability of directors and officers when an employee or agent commits an offense where it can be proven that the employee or agent acted or committed the offense with such person's knowledge, authority, permission, or consent, expressed or implied. Mr. Speaker, Clause 56 of the bill provides for the provisions of the bill to trump contractual obligations. Administrative fines for non-compliance with the provisions of the bill is set out in Clause 57. These fines range from $50,000 for individuals and $200,000 for companies. Clause 58 to 60 deals with miscellaneous items, including the minister's power to make regulations on a number of issues, such as prescribes forms, administrative fines, thresholds for various types of facility holders, entities deemed financial institutions as examples. The first schedule to the Act provides the details that must be included in a suspicious transaction report. The second schedule outlines the composition of the Compliance Commission and its terms. Mr. Speaker, this Act is forward-looking and contemplates flexibility to adapt to developing international trends and creativity on the part of the regulators and persons that would seek to utilize our jurisdiction for undesirable activities. We are hopeful that it will serve the country for many years. Mr. Speaker, moving on to the Proceeds of Crime Bill. The Proceeds of Crime Bill 2018 seeks to consolidate, strengthen, and modernize the provisions relating to preventative and investigative measures against money laundering, terrorism financing, terrorism, corruption, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, human trafficking, the recovery of proceeds and instrumentalities of crime, including providing for civil forfeiture of the proceeds of crime conducted and illicit cash. The bill introduces powers relating to unexplained wealth, investigative orders, the Confiscated Assets Fund, and a Confiscated Assets Committee. Mr. Speaker, the Proceeds of Crime Bill addresses the concerns and recommendations made in the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force report of 2015. By addressing the CFATF concerns in the Proceeds of Crime Bill, the Bahamas demonstrates again that it is a clean, robust, safe, and reliable jurisdiction in which to live, prosper, and conduct business. Mr. Speaker, from the provisions of the bill, one can clearly see that the Bahamas is instrumental in the fight against financial and acquisitive crime and money laundering. Mr. Speaker, one of the main features of the Proceeds of Crime Bill is the continuation of the Confiscated Assets Fund, which was established under Proceeds of Crime Act 2000. The purpose of the Confiscated Assets Fund is to receive and distribute property which is made available following orders made under the bill. The bill also provides for the reestablishment of the Confiscated Assets Committee, its composition and operational procedures, which are contained in Part 9 of the bill, and includes the Minister of Finance as to be the chairperson, the Minister of National Security, the Attorney General, the Commissioner of Police, and such other persons as designated by the Minister. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the usual preliminary provisions, Part 2 of the bill seeks to establish administrative bodies, namely a Ministerial Council and Identified Risk Framework Steering Committee. These bodies are being introduced to bring the Bahamas in compliance with FATF Recommendation 2, which mandates that countries establish coordinating mechanisms to oversee their national identified risk frameworks. Mr. Speaker, identified risk offenses is contained in Part 3 of the bill, and clauses 7 to 20 of the bill provides for the offenses related to the identified risk, including offenses of money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. Defenses to certain offenses are also provided. Mr. Speaker, Part 4 of the bill pertains to conviction-based confiscations. An order made under this part shall be proved on the balance of probabilities, which is the lower standard for the burden of proof in civil proceedings as opposed to the criminal standard. Further, two types of orders are provided for under Part 4 of the bill. In particular, the confiscation order, which is forfeiture of property to the government, which represents proceeds of crime or terrorist property, and two, the benefit recovery order, which is a sum equal to the benefit to the individual as a result of his conviction. Mr. Speaker, Part 5 of the bill deals with non-conviction-based civil forfeitures. This introduces a new power of non-conviction-based civil forfeiture of properties that is or represents the proceeds, instrumentalities, or terrorist property. There is no requirement for a prior criminal conviction. An application is determined, again, on the basis of the balance of probabilities. Mr. Speaker, Part 6 of the bill relating to cash and personal property forfeiture establishes provisions for cash and personal property obtained through unlawful conduct, or which is intended to be used in unlawful conduct, to be forfeited in civil proceedings before the court, whether or not those proceedings in regard to an offense before the court. Mr. Speaker, unexplained wealth orders is captured in Part 7 of the bill. Clauses 76 to 83 introduces a new concept into our judicial system of unexplained wealth orders. And Mr. Speaker, we know that there are many people who question unexplained wealth of various persons, particularly those who may be operating in the public sector. This part also applies to a specified list of persons who have been charged with certain crimes as specified in Clause 76(2)(b) of the bill. Mr. Speaker, the proposed legislation will require the repeal of the existing legislation and the subsidiary legislation made thereunder, as the clauses of this bill add to, strengthen, and modernize provisions relating to confiscation orders, as well in relation to the provisions relating to the investigation of crime and search for evidence. Mr. Speaker, with the enactment of the Proceeds of Crime Bill 2018, the Bahamas will show that it is committed to adhering to and upholding international standards and best practices in the fight against money laundering and/or terrorist financing and proliferation financing. The Bahamas must continue to exercise vigilance so that the jurisdiction is protected from abuse and misuse by money launderers and terrorist organizations. By doing so, the Bahamas will remain a competitive financial service jurisdiction with a stable and safe environment which is conducive to business. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I so move the bill. Two bills.
Is there a seconder? The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamacraw.
Mr. Speaker, I stand as a seconder to the bills that were introduced, and may I commend the Deputy Prime Minister for his clear and concise articulation of the Financial Transaction Reporting Bill and the Proceeds of Crime Bill. Speaker, before I go into my presentation this morning, I beg leave of you to make mention of a gentleman that I had the good privilege of visiting with this morning in the person of Reverend Vincent Moss. He taught me trade and I've always told this house and this country of my educational experience, having not finished high school. But I had the good fortune, God had blessed me with the good fortune to meet Reverend Moss, who taught me trade, joinery, and as I would go to him and learn trade in the day, I went to school in the evening. But one of the most important things that I got from Reverend Vincent Moss is a lecture or lesson on life, how to be a man, how to respect my neighbor, my neighbor's property, and how not ever in this life to give up. And I went to his house, see him this morning, after he'd had, I think, 2 strokes. His wife, Sister Moss, is not doing well. She's now hospitalized. And one of the things that he reassured me, the Reverend Moss said, I'm not giving up, and I'm doing well. And he expressed his delight for me, and as he did then, he expressed how proud he was and is of me and the blessings that God has bestowed on my life and my family. So I know that he is at home this morning. I want to say publicly, Reverend Moss, that you're one of those unsung heroes that we never hear about. But it's because of their nurturing, their agitation, and their will not to give up on persons that a lot of us who sit in this house today are where we are. And so I want to thank God for him. I want to say that I love him, I respect him, and that I'm indebted to him. I also would like to thank the good people of Yamacraw for sending me here to represent them in this honorable place. Mr. Speaker, in thanking the good people of Yamacraw, I want to say just one thing, and I promised myself when I came to this house that I would never forget this, and that is that I'm a Bahamian. I have to always show respect for the sovereignty of this country. By showing respect for the sovereignty of this country, I must be loyal and committed to it. And as I said before, we don't always talk about civics and those persons, whether they be Bahamian or not, who've contributed to the development of this country. But I don't see St. Barnabas here today. And when we had a presentation in the community, the AG attended that presentation. And I had cause to speak about Mr. Edmund Moxie and urban renewal. The man who was the brainchild of that concept that we laud, and we still today celebrate, and I'm not convinced that we fully appreciate the socio-political and economic thrust that Mr. Moxie had, and the love for the country, because there and then you had a man speaking about creating museums, Gombe Village, celebrating our foods, and as the Deputy Prime Minister says, we're going to celebrate this year we're going to celebrate the right of women to vote, celebrating women, and taking that pride in it that when he presents it to somebody, they want to get to know it and they want to experience it. And I said on that night, you know, we have not as yet, as a country, and even those who benefited from it, haven't shown the level of respect and strength to acknowledge Mr. Edmund Moxie for what he has done in this country. So I want to say to St. Barnabas, as I said to Mr. Moxie's son, that I'm prepared to commit some of my own monies, not to creating, and I love the fact that we have, and Michael? Yes. No, you're going to give some money. But I'm going to present some of my own monies. And I remember as a boy when I would travel from Kid Island to Nassau, we would go to the cloisters. And you see the size of those statues that they have of our European brothers and sisters. Well, we're not going to create one that's half size like Mr. Milo Butler. And I think he was a giant of a man. He deserves better. When I look at Sir Lyndon, whether, no matter our politics, he deserved a much larger statue. And so I'm going to say to him that I would like to see, you know, while we have Mr. Percy Vola Francis, I want to rush, recreate that rush, get that experience. And in the drums here, our ancestors speaking to us. And so that is why I speak to the whole issue of sovereignty, loyalty and respect for this country. And there was a man in Mr. Edmund Moxie who did that, who gave the ultimate sacrifice, lost his career and almost everything. But what he didn't lose was the strength in character and spirit, because he was kicking until the day he died. So may God continue to bless him. I expect great things, and I'm going to encourage St. Barnabas for us to do that. And may God continue to bless my unsung hero, and as we have all through the length and breadth of the Bahamas, Reverend Vincent O. Moss. Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to start from the speech of the throne, given by and articulated so eloquently by the Governor General, Dame Marguerite Pinland, where she spoke to the intention of her government to create an environment in the Bahamas where both international and local persons, whether they be investors or just the common average man, would have confidence, not just to live and work, but confidence to invest in this country. And so you would have seen, since the minister-led government came to power, a number of legislations, a number of actions that were deliberately taken to reinforce both local and international confidence in the Bahamas for persons to once again want to do business in the Bahamas. And that decision, or the decision which guided the actions, were not in a vacuum. It took cognizance of not just the international observations and how things were being done in our country, but it took cognizance of the media, the average ordinary person. And so my leader set the trail ablaze and had the courage, thank you very much, to bring legislation that would reinstill confidence by identifying, and this is the concept that he identified, transparency and accountability in governance. And he had, identifying transparency and accountability in governance. We have introduced the Proceeds of Crime Bill. We have introduced the Ombudsman legislation. There was also an open, honest, and fair engagement of the public and private sector with the the Interception of Communications Bill. And I would like to thank publicly the Bahamas Bar Association, the persons who sat on that panel, Mr. Hilton, QC from Jamaica, Mr. Maurice Glinton, QC from New Providence, and the venerable one, pardon me? From Freeport, thank you, from Freeport. And I know he wouldn't mind if I call him the venerable one, a man that I respect. There are those that may have their views about him, but I love and respect him in the person of Mr. Wayne Monroe, who graced that panel. And I had the good fortune to sit on that panel at the University of the Bahamas. And we discussed, pardon me? Yeah, we and we discussed that legislation. At the end of the day, you had those esteemed, eminent legal luminaries all identifying the fact that the time has come, if we're gonna give law enforcement agencies the necessary tools to fight sophisticated and technologically advanced, and this is how they think today, criminals, we need to bring the legislation into force. And what Mr. Monroe suggested is that while we consult, and he says the consultation must not take too long, because you still have a defective Listening Devices Act, and you still have non-existent laws that do not deal with certain areas of crime, like cyber crime, and how persons move large sums of monies, or how they deal with trafficking in persons, or drug proceeds. And so I just want to mention that. And the reason why I mention that is because it allows me to go into the Financial Transaction Reporting Act, and as I said very earlier, that the Deputy Prime Minister did an excellent job in going through the legislation, identifying the core aspects of the legislation. But I would like to say this, in keeping with my government's approach. Our government. No, I'm not the Prime Minister. In keeping with, he said, our government. And keep it, I took ownership of the whole thing in terms of, that's all right, that's all right. I like my aunties on Cat Island. That's okay. Man, listen, when they think about it, you swear they really own it. Yeah. I say, no, you got it. So our government, in terms of our approach to these legislation, the Prime Minister requires wide consultation. And so even with these bills, they were sent out. We had meetings with members in the community in terms of how we will approach these bills. So I just want to say that we had wide consultation on this, and the consultative process still goes on. And so I want to say to members who are listening or watching by way of television, is that if you have an idea or a way that you can improve governance, most certainly have town meetings, you can still forward your suggestions and they will be considered. But in speaking of, pardon me? In speaking to how crime and how the investigation techniques have moved on, and my segue, my speaking to the Interception of Communications Bill, there's a common thread, a golden thread that you would see going through all of the legislation. Just prior to coming in, just after taking governance, we signed on to the Mutual Evaluation Convention, I think the Mutual Evaluation Convention, where we agreed, and I think the member for Cat Island, Rumkey, Cat Island, and Salvador agreed the importance of us signing there, and it identified these issues that run through these bills, and that is the identified risk. Looking at corruption, cybercrime, human trafficking, money laundering, the proliferation of financial weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, or financing of terrorism, or such other risks. We also introduced the Integrity Commission Bill that underscores the whole concept of anti-corruption. And the reason why I'm speaking to all these things, Mr. Speaker, is because there's a specific intent. This is where we're down and we're now restoring confidence in our country. To cause persons to want to go in a place like Freeport, an excellent place to do business, and to create an IT mecca. To cause multi-billion-dollar companies and individuals to want to come to the Bahamas and in a symbiotic way, create relationships with our government and our people so that all will benefit from it. But there was one thing that these legislations are not just attempting to do, but will do, is that they will get rid of this whole concept of, and I just heard it whispered, a kickback. It would get rid of what, and I know I hear persons saying, oh, this government is just marching to the dogmas of the international community. Well, whether you accept it or not, I consider Bahamas to be one of the big dogs in the international community.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Because at one stage, we have created a tourism product that invites millions of persons from every continent and almost every village in the world to come. We were able, 300-odd thousand persons, 400-odd thousand persons, and I'm quite sure that the side opposite would agree, to create a financial service industry that was at one time second to none. And the reason why we were able to do it was because we were able then, and as we are doing now, is to ensure not just the local community, but the international community, that this is a safe place. The reason why that we're going to be able, and we're going to sail to the same heights again, is that we're able to say, and look the World Bank in the eye, look the IDB in the eye, and look the IMF in the eye, and say the time for corrupt contracts, or even the Americans who were alleging that we were millions of dollars in corrupt contracts. We were able, and I want to commend the Prime Minister publicly. I'm going to go into the bills, but see, this is what we have done. And I'm giving this address for anybody who is saying that the minister-led government does not have a plan. We have also introduced, Mr. Speaker, we have also...
You approved the deal, you know.
Mr. Speaker...
That's right.
Mr. Speaker...
Honorable members.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, where I will begin where I last... Yes, I'm following the time. I will begin where I stopped. That on the Americans who not just suggested, but challenged us that we were millions of dollars in corrupt contracts. One of the things that they identified, and other persons would have identified, is our land registry, the way we deal with land. The United Bahamian Party in the late 60s had introduced a land registry bill. The side opposite, Mr. Speaker, campaigned on it. And my Prime Minister, and we've already started public consultation on it, has introduced for discussion and for passing, and I want to say now that Yamakro has a suggestion for the amendments to the bill, and I'll say that just when I go on. But there's a reason why I'm looking at it. Because the power base in any country is land. And here you have a Prime Minister that ran on the whole concept of accountability and transparency, saying we will clear up land so that the Linden Pinland Estates and Bozane Town would be no more. No more. So that we will not be able to sell land over and over again and have the international community saying, listen, I want to invest. But when I do my research, there's some uncertainty in the way you deal with land. And so my Prime Minister's laid the Land Adjudication Bill, the Law of Property Act, and the Registered Land Act. The only thing I would like to see, one of the things I'd like to see, and I know that Mr. Elliott Lockhart is listening, is that we fully appreciate and recognize this whole concept of generation property. Yes. And if you find that a person or an individual or a family has a right to 5,000 acres or 500 acres, that's how people are going now, and I experience it at Legal Aid. I see Angliston there, and when I see a brother, where they went in, and persons, because they had the finances, took hundreds of acres from poor people. So this is an attempt to right a historical wrong, but not just to right a historical wrong, but to bring transparency and accountability to land in the Bahamas as we provide, or as my Prime Minister and his government provide, affordable home and housing for people.
Yes.
And so, Mr. Speaker, as I spoke earlier about the golden thread that runs not just through the interception of communications bill, and I'm deliberately saying that because that's the one come, but the golden thread that runs through the Proceeds of Crime bill and the golden thread that runs through the Financial Transaction Reporting bill, the full intent is to introduce accountability in these procedures. No? Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to say something briefly about this Proceeds of Crime bill, because I know that it makes provisions, and one of the things my Prime Minister or our government is careful to do is to strike a balance in these bills, because these bills look at property rights, they look at personal rights, and these bills create sometimes some incursion on the way we do business, a serious incursion. But while striking the balance to secure the fundamental rights of the individual, my government wants to reassure the Bahamian public that there is a zero tolerance for crime. And I know there's always the concern that you're always going at the people over the hill. But these bills focus on the banks, the trust companies, in some extent, insurance companies, and the way we basically do business in this country. And so I want, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, to look at the whole concept of unexplained wealth. And the Proceeds of Crime Act identifies persons who participate in criminal activity in the Bahamas. And I want to focus especially, because they do great work, persons in the public sector, persons, MPs, politically exposed persons, and the way we are called upon now to do business in this country. And I quite recall when we first took government, the Prime Minister brought a piece of legislation and said, Johnson, I want you all to look at this. And it was a conventional piece of legislation from the UK. And it looked at unexplained wealth. Because we realized in the Bahamas, and I'm speaking in layman terms, that sometimes people come to Parliament, or sometimes people get certain positions, and overnight they're millionaires. I don't see how it could happen. As a young man, a former president of the bar, in this coming into politics, I don't see how you could work that miracle. because I am.
Rich overnight.
You know,
Rich overnight.
I'm working with my wife to see how we can work this out.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
And I know we don't have any Rumpelstiltskins in Parliament
No, we're not
who are
using
able
gold.
to sow straw into gold.
No,
But it seems as if we've had too many who've come to this place and were able to do it.
overnight.
And so one of the aspects of the bill is to look at, is to look at unexplained wealth from section 57 of the bill to 64. And it gives the court the power where the courts find that a person cannot reasonably explain how that person would have gained certain wealth, and it gives the court the power to seize property. It gives the court the power to seize funds and to return them to the people of the Bahamas
Where they rightfully belong.
where they rightfully belong.
People's money.
It also gives the court an opportunity to give freezing orders and investigative orders to go and find funds where someone cannot reasonably explain it. And there's a reason why I speak this way, Mr. Speaker. If persons want me to come to their church or their place and give a talk, I can do that. But I realize that the majority of people who sit down sometimes and watch television as they speak to me are some of the older folk who want you to get straight to the nitty-gritty. And so the Proceedings of Crime Act prevents persons from committing acts of corruption, money laundering, and other crimes, and allows the government to go in and take those funds. And it allows for the court to grant orders for unexplained wealth orders. There's just one other area that I would like to look at. And it's the non-conviction based forfeiture. And then there's where somebody is convicted of an offense under this act and the court is able to take funds. And so I want persons to know that the concepts that are being introduced in the Proceedings of Crime Act already exist. Under the Dangerous Drugs Act, I had a case, well, I wouldn't use my case, but in the UK, whether you're innocent or not, a jumbo jet flew in and was coming from Asia, and they found a quantity of drugs on the plane. And the legislation in the UK allowed them just to take it. And so there's already legislation that provides that where you find funds or property, that the law entitles the government, because this is how serious it is. And I quite recall in looking at the Court of Appeal decision, the Court of Appeal identified that the legislation, when a plane was taken in the Bahamas, they say, yes, it's draconian. But the way the proliferation of drugs in the Bahamas and the way it's going, we have to take draconian measures.
Yes, yes.
And so, in order to reinstill confidence, money found in closets too.
Unexplained.
Money found in closets, and so it allows the government to go and to take it. And Mr. Speaker, what we are careful to do, what we are careful to do in these proceedings, Mr. Speaker, is we are careful to make laws that we are comfortable to live with when we would have demitted office. So, Mr. Speaker, I support these bills. I would like to say to members of the public that my government is prepared, and every member of Parliament is prepared through town meetings to have discussions on these bills. From the private sector, we've been prepared to invite some of those persons to explain the bills. But the bills are generally designed, they are designed to rid this country of our most vexing infection that we met on coming into government, and that is corruption. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a second time and committed. A bill for an act to repeal and replace the Financial Transactions Reporting Act and for matters connected thereto. As many? The chair recognizes the honourable member for Cat Island, Rumkey, and San Salvador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member, just before the motion, the chair wishes to recognize a number of visitors in the gallery. We have a retired Court of Appeal judge from Alberta, Canada, Mr. John Cote, and his friends. And also, before we proceed to the suspension, the chair has received a request from the opposition with respect to making a statement on the women's suffrage movement and the anniversary of women's right to vote. And the chair has acceded to that request. And I just wish to say that when I arrived in New Providence from Great Inagua, I was adopted by Miss Althea Mortimer, who is the mother of the late Dr. Granville Bain and the late Senator Lawrence Clinton. I grew up with Miss Althea Mortimer. She was a part of the women's suffragist movement. I remember in my early days in Government High School, she would take us on the Southern Recreation Ground to the political rallies. And one evening in particular that stuck with me was when Mahalia Jackson was at that particular rally, and she was singing the song "We Shall Overcome." And I remember that from the days of my youth. And so I recognize the very valuable contribution that our women have played in the development, the historical development of democracy in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Honourable member. The chair recognizes the honourable member for Angliston.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, I rise with a sense of bold humility and a heart filled with gratitude to commemorate this date, which the member for East Grand Bahama gave recognition to in his contribution, which is the date on which the right for women to vote, the legislation, became enacted. It was in fact passed by Parliament, I think, on the 9th of February, but acceded to by, I guess, by the, throughout the entire process and gazetted on the 23rd of February and became law. And Mr. Speaker, this anniversary marked the culmination of a very long and difficult history that women have had in human history, and not just in this country. There was a time that, and if you give an analysis to this history of women, I think that retrospectively, I think that it would be appreciated by all that the struggle has been very real and has been a very long one. There was a time, Mr. Speaker, that women were not encouraged to have access to education and stopped at a particular point. They were not encouraged to get into professions. Women could not hold property, and then when they could, married women couldn't. And then, of course, they had to pass legislation for that. And then when a woman married, her identity subsumed into that of her husband. The inheritance law excluded women. Women, it is reputed that a woman, it was law, or it was accepted that a woman could be chastised by an instrument the width of her husband's thumb. The divorce laws favored men, and women could barely get a divorce under for almost no reason whatsoever. And in truth, women were second-class citizens in this country. And of course, as I've indicated, the struggle has been global. But in our own country, we have been second-class citizens. And so the suffrage movement which culminated in the legislation that we're now commemorating, was one that we hold up high in our country because it highlighted the activism of women who were described, I think I saw a quote, as being courageous, determined, intelligent, and fierce. But what was interesting about them, they not only fought for the right to vote, they became activists for social justice in this country, even when they could not vote. And so the involvement of women could be seen in 1958 strike, the general strike. Women were there, you look at the photographs, they were holding defiant placards. And then we had the famous Doris Johnson speech when she tried to address the parliament from the bar, and she was moved to the magistrates' court, where she gave her famous speech about the role of women and women being taxpayers and being able to have the right to participate in a more fundamental way. And so the name, until this night, and then again in Black Tuesday, the women were downstairs on Bay Street. So women have been involved not just in the struggle for the right to vote, they became involved in the larger effort. And some of the great names have emerged. And can I just say the Progressive Liberal Party threw its weight behind these efforts and was singularly identified with the suffrage movement. And some of the names, and one who was not, I don't think, a member of the Progressive Liberal Party was Mary Ingram. She became one of the distinguished leaders. Doris Johnson, we heard the speaker refer to Althea Mortimer, Mary Walker, Bertha Isaacs, and Eugenia Lockhart, Georgiana Simonet. These are women I've called, when I just talk about them before, I call them Thunder Rebel because they were such courageous women. And on the issue of Doris Johnson really holds a singularly distinguished place in our history because she became the first woman ever to offer for a seat in 1962. No woman had ever done it before that. And then she became, in 67, the first woman leader of government business in the She eventually became the first minister of government, the female minister. She was Minister of Transport. She became first woman to become president of the Senate. And so really, in truth, Doris Johnson really paved the way for the women who came afterwards, like a Janet Bostwick and an Italia Johnson, of whom we are very proud of their achievements and in this parliament. And so I want to put the historical perspective of the involvement of women in the advancement of our country. But I want to say, though, that while we commemorate this date, and there have been many benchmarks achieved since then, and women continue to face cultural bias in our country, and we continue to face legal discrimination in our country, and we continue to face invisible barriers in this country. And so we see it in particular in the political realm, and I won't go much into that, but we continue to be underrepresented in this House. And so I want to take this opportunity to highlight the struggle and the achievements, but to also put a spotlight on the continuing challenges women continue to face in this country. But I want to pay respect and to pay homage to the foremothers and to admonish ourselves, particularly us in this parliament, the women in this parliament, of our continuing obligation to purposely advance the cause of women for equality under our law. And so on behalf of the members on this side, I want to express our heartfelt gratitude and a sense of humility in commemorating this date, and say how proud I am as a woman in this parliament to follow in their great footsteps. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the great and courageous women of the constituency of Fox Hill and women throughout this country. Mr. Speaker, growing up in a village like Fox Hill, I had strong female role models. You might have heard that the straw market and entrepreneurship was started by women from Fox Hill marching to sell their wares downtown.
My example was my mother, Nurse Miriam Ward-Pratt. She told me that as a girl, she was one of those that won a scholarship to Government High. And she rode her bicycle from Fox Hill to Government High there in Nassau Court. A little slip of a girl. And she felt that she could achieve anything, that the world was her oyster. And the women in Fox Hill drilled it into us that you can do whatever you want to do. You can achieve whatever you can achieve. Mr. Speaker, a majority rule day, I was the keynote speaker at Stanlands Primary School. You will remember that I spoke to you during the budget debate, my maiden speech in this house. And I spoke about a little girl in Fox Hill who started her own business at age 7. Entrepreneurship, strong women. Mr. Speaker, I also told the students at Stanlands Primary School that majority day rule came about because women finally got the vote. And it would have come. It absolutely would have come, but it came quicker because women got the vote. Our house is majority in here are men, and that is something that we have to change, and I know we will change. I know it will change, and it's when it will change, and I'm very proud to be a part of the party that brought about a lot of the changes that spoke to women moving up in this chamber and in high places in this country. But Mr. Speaker, in our country at large, women are reluctant to take the step into politics because of our mores and what they call a dirty game. But I want to encourage women out there that lots of people fought for us to have this right, for us to be here. And we must honor them by taking that bold step forward and running for the House of Assembly. We can't complain about what the men do when we don't step forward and say, take me. I am willing. I will sacrifice. And it is indeed a sacrifice, Mr. Speaker, because my people always tell me that I have to go to the hairdresser every week. They tell me that I have to get my nails done. And I say, well, these guys just need to shave and get a haircut, and they're okay. But when we have a level playing field, and women know that no matter what, they are just as capable of running this country as any man. I love my male colleagues. I love working with them. I find it a challenge, but I'm equal to the challenge. So on this day, I honor those women who marched, who I had the honor of working with Lawrence Clinton for some years, and his mother was one of those in the forefront. And what he told me, and the times when my energy might have flagged a little bit, what these women went through, it had to go on. And then I think of women like Janet Bostwick and Irma Williams and all of those before me. They tell the story of a time when, yes, women had gotten the vote and women could sit in this legislature. But if you wore a color that was different, it was the hard road to hoe. But they persevered, and they persevered. And so for women of every color, every hue, I encourage you to pay tribute to the women who have gone before us and step forward and help to run this country. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say it's not an easy task, but it's a task that we're up to. And my colleagues in this House, we are learning. But we will persevere. Thank you.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for West Grand Bahama and Bimini.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the great constituents of West Grand Bahama and Bimini, in particular at this time, all of our women in our wonderful constituency. It is an honor to be in this House, Mr. Speaker, and while the number of women are very, very small compared to our male counterparts, I know that our voice has always echoed throughout this country. And as we sit here today and we speak about the women's suffrage movement and knowing all of those persons who would have participated and basically led the way for us to be here today, we are indeed grateful that you had those women stepping forward. Oftentimes, as the member for Fox Hill indicated, women are so afraid of coming forward because they do believe that the political arena is a game or it is something that is dirty. A lot of men come forward because of the fact that we believe them to be very strong physically. Women are also strong creatures. Our emotion is very needed in an arena that sometimes can be very hard. I think as mothers and daughters, we lend something to the political landscape of this country that is very much needed. There has to be a softer side. I think of politics as both tough and tender, and while we may argue as to exactly who's the toughest, it has both room for everything, okay? So our male counterparts, we're tough internally. We're grateful for women in our country who would impact all sectors, whether it's the judiciary. We have women who are in key positions as permanent secretaries. We have teachers, and the whole landscape of the country, no matter how we look at it, is impacted by women. I think that even here today, you know, our member of Parliament for Fox Hill, she was the first Olympian in the country. We think of our first, as we mentioned, for our party, the Free National Movement, in the names of Janet Bostwick, Dame Ivy Dumont, Sylvia Scriven, and also Talia Johnson. At the end of the day, women have a contribution to make. I think that the foundation that was set in our country is a very strong one. And when you look at that foundation, we can always build. And for a members of Parliament such as myself, who's very young in this arena, I take very much a lot of pride in knowing that some things that had to be fought were done already, and it's so much easier for me to go towards that glass ceiling and making an impact in our country. And as the member of Parliament for Fox Hill indicated, we need not be afraid of arenas such as the political arena, because at the end of the day, all of our voices are important. And I think that the more we come forward and contribute to the landscape of our country and our legislation and policies as women, the better off we will be. We don't want to come in as lions roaring to make our male counterparts feel that we're always looking for a first. We don't want that. We want always to know that we're here to complement your work. We're here to basically work alongside you so that we can have a better country. And on those given days when we need to roar, we will roar, and sometimes it counts. So don't be afraid of that when it happens. At the end of the day, we're here to work with you. We're here to complement you in all sectors of our country. We thank those women that started it. We thank those women that are doing it now, and we thank those women who will do it in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Having said all of that, Mr. Speaker, we do appreciate our women. At this stage, Mr. Speaker, we will suspend. I do move that the House do suspend until March 1st, Thursday, at 10 a.m.
Is there a seconder? It has been moved and seconded that the business of this House do suspend to 10 a.m. Thursday, March 1st, 2018. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will rise. The business of this House stands suspended to 10 a.m. March 1st, 2018.